"And where will you go?" Laura asked. "Ellie and I are going to Third Earth." Journal number 37, Chapter 20. Moving between territories is incredibly easy now. It's like stepping through a sheer curtain and passing from one room to another. No more flumes, no more crawling through secret places to find hidden tunnels that carry us along on a carpet of light and music. Best of all, no more quigs. All we have to do is think about where we want to go, take a step, and hello, we're there. Still, it's disorienting. It may be like stepping from one room to the next, but they are two very different rooms. And it's not like I could think, I want to go to Third Earth at 2:30 on Thursday afternoon and land on the bench that's behind the library. We still have to rely on the forces of Solara to put us exactly where we need to be and when we need to be there. I'm not really sure how the spirits know, but they've done a pretty good job so far. This time was no different, though what happened when Ellie and I first set foot back on Third Earth made me long for the familiar old gates at the end of a flume trip. We held hands and stepped into the same hazy swirl of dust that we'd found on our last visit. There wasn't much else to see, but there was plenty to hear. A loud, angry grinding sound assaulted us. It was mechanical, and it was getting louder. Ellie and I froze. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know when we were. We didn't know what the sound was, or if we should be worried about it. In other words, we didn't know a thing. "Look out!" came a desperate cry. Desperate cries were not good, especially if they came as a warning. "Heads up!" We looked up quickly to see a shadow overhead that was coming our way. I didn't have time to register or to react. Luckily, Mark Diamond did. Ellie and I were half tackled, half shoved out of the way. Mark wasn't being gentle either. He manhandled us toward the wreck of a car and pretty much threw us behind it. "What is it?" I gasped. "Trouble." Oh, I figured that. I barely had time to peek out from behind the barrier to see what he meant. The shadow was a helicopter. I expected it to start firing at us, but its path was too steep. It was flying straight for the ground. Actually, it wasn't flying at all. It was falling. Ellie gasped. A second later, the large black chopper smashed into the ground. The cabin crumbled and bucked forward. The rotor dug into the dirt. I was transfixed by the destructive violence. It was a good thing Mark was still thinking. He grabbed us both and pulled us down behind the car wreck. The next sound we heard was the squealing of tortured metal, followed by the sharp thumps of shrapnel that hit the far side of the wreck. The rotors had broken up on contact, spewing sharp pieces everywhere. The car windows exploded, raining glass down on us. Chunks of metal flew overhead and dug into the ground behind us. If we had been standing up, we would have been shredded. Ellie clung to me in fear. It was a rude welcome to Third Earth. I looked to Mark. He was staring backward, his gaze fixed. This wasn't the Mark I knew. Besides being older, he had an intensity that I'd rarely seen in anyone. The grinding sound of the crash continued for a few more seconds, then ended. No more falling parts, no more screaming engine. All we heard was the soft hiss and tick of hot metal. "Are the Ravinians attacking?" I asked. Mark's answer was to jump up and sprint for the destroyed chopper. "Wait here," I said to Ellie, and followed him. Mark ran straight for the wreck. A few others came running from other directions. A quick look around told me that we were back in the empty lot in Manhattan where Mark and I had landed the chopper we hijacked from the conclave of Ravinia. The garage that held the stolen helicopters was off to our right. It looked as if this doomed helicopter barely cleared the top of that garage before crashing. The downed helicopter no longer looked anything like a flying vehicle. The engine was winding down. The cabin had become a twisted ball of black metal. The rotor was gone, having been flung in pieces every which way. I still didn't know who was inside. Was Mark running to make sure that a Ravinian dado wasn't going to jump out and attack? I didn't think so. It seemed like he was more worried about helping the guy who was inside. He got to the wreck and yanked on the door. or what was left of it. Mark had to pull with all he had. With an agonizing screech of metal, he managed to muscle it open. "It's okay," he said to the guy inside. "We got you." "No!" came a cry from inside the chopper. "I can't move." I made it to the rack and looked over Mark's shoulder to the horror within. The pilot wasn't a dado. The blood in his pained expression told me that much. He didn't look like a Ravinian either. His clothes were too shabby. This was definitely a friend. It was a gruesome sight because his body was impossibly contorted inside the twisted wreck. Mark reached for his arm and pulled. The guy screamed in pain. "Don't!" he cried. "My back!" The guy was in a seriously bad way. He took short, quick breaths as his eyes darted back and forth, focusing on nothing. I figured if his back was broken, there was no way he would survive. The blood wasn't a good sign either. There was lots of it. Medical care on the new Third Earth was non-existent, at least outside of the Ravinian conclave. Okay, Mark said, trying to calm the poor guy. "We'll cut the wreck away from you." Mark stuttered. He may have been all strong and in charge, but he was still Mark, and he was under stress. He gave me a look that said it all. His friend wasn't going to make it. The others crowded around, trying to get a glimpse, but Mark put his arm out to hold them back. He took a breath to calm himself. There was nothing he could do to save the guy. It was now about making his last few moments less terrifying. "You made it," Mark said, soothing. "You got back. I'm proud of you, Antonio." The guy, Antonio, focused on Mark and smiled. "Don't think we'll be able to use this chopper, though." He spoke in pained gasps. "Sure we will," Mark said, faking confidence. "There's only a couple of dings. We'll get it back in the air." "Good," Antonio gasped. "We're going to need it. We're going to need everything we have." "What happened?" Mark said, leaning in close to the doomed man. "They're coming," Antonio said between labored breaths. I wasn't sure if his eyes were wild from pain or from fear. "Worse than we thought." Antonio started to sob. He was out of his mind. "Get out, Mark. Get everyone out of the city. Away from here. What we saw, it's impossible, but it's real. I saw it." "What was it, Antonio?" Mark asked with a touch of desperation. "What did you see?" "The factory," Antonio said. His eyes closed. He was losing consciousness. "Antonio!" Mark barked. "What about the factory?" "Where they built the choppers. We stole one. Nearly got away. But they attacked. My guys, all killed." "How many?" I asked Mark quietly. "4, including Antonio," was his answer. "Were they exiles?" I asked. Mark nodded. 3 more exiles had been killed. Of the original 20 exiles who came here with Mark from Chloral, 9 were left. I was afraid it would soon be 8. Antonio leaned forward. The small move was painful. I saw it in his eyes and the way he winced, but it didn't stop him. He needed Mark to understand. "I think they found them," he whispered. "Who? Found who?" Mark asked. "We heard them talking. After they finish us, they're going after them. That's what they've been doing. All this time they've been getting ready to go after them." "Who, Antonio?" Mark begged. "Who are they going after?" Antonio could barely get the words out. His voice was growing weaker, but I heard. "They've found the rest of the exiles." "What?" I shouted. Antonio didn't expect to hear another voice. His eyes looked around in confusion, searching for who had shouted. I pushed next to Mark so he could see me. "Where are they, Antonio? Where are the other exiles? Are they here on Third Earth?" Antonio shook his head. I don't know how he found the strength. Maybe it was easier than speaking. "I don't know," he said, defeated. "After they come for us, they're going after the rest. Get out, Mark. Run. Hide. We can't stand up to what they've got. It's over." Antonio closed his eyes for the last time. His face grew relaxed. He was at peace. I wondered if his spirit had joined the others in Solara. Mark didn't move. He stared at his fallen friend. I didn't say anything. There was too much to absorb and process. I didn't know Antonio, but in those short few moments, his last, I found out that he was a very brave guy. A hero, even. Mark looked away from his fallen friend to me. It was the old Mark, the young Mark. His expression was a cross between grief, confusion, and fear. I sensed he was looking to me for answers. I had one, but it wasn't the time to tell him. He glanced over his shoulder to see a few of his other friends watching. They were close enough to have heard all that Antonio said. They looked worse than Mark. Ellie was there too. She heard it all. She stood alone, looking lost and afraid. "Let's get him out of here," Mark announced with authority. "Then we have to hide this wreck. We don't want anything to be seen from the air." He looked at me and added, "Are you here for a while?" "For as long as it takes," I answered. "Good," he replied. "You can help." They put me in charge of digging the grave. It was an experience I'd managed to avoid up till that point. But I guess with all that had happened over the past few years, it was inevitable. I made sure that Ellie was safe inside the warehouse, then found a shovel and walked across the street to a spot that Mark had directed me to. It was an empty schoolyard. I saw the vague outline of a baseball diamond. Toys were scattered around. A deflated kickball, a ballerina slipper, the arm of a doll. I wondered when the last time was that these toys had been played with. I had to force myself to stop thinking that way. As important as this job was, I didn't want to spend time looking back. There was trouble ahead. That's where we needed to focus. Burying the dead was looking back. Still, it had to be done. I got to work, digging a long, narrow hole among the sad reminders of a past civilization. The ground was soft, I was glad to discover. It allowed me to work fast. The mindless act of digging gave me the chance to dissect Antonio's last words. The Ravinians were planning an attack. That much was clear. It sounded like Antonio and his team had found the factory where they built their gunships and didn't like what they saw. It could mean that the Ravinians were building a lot more choppers in order to launch some kind of massive aerial assault. Was this the final plan for Third Earth? Were the Ravinians going to wipe out every last non-Ravinian they could find? Or was it going to be practice for their ultimate goal, which was to wipe out the exiles, and the remaining spirit of Solara along with them? If they were building helicopters, did that mean that all the exiles were somewhere here on Third Earth? It seemed likely. That would be the ultimate turning point for Third Earth. If the last hope for Solara was here, destroying the exiles would give St. Dane his final victory. Halla would be his. The more I thought of this possibility, the more it made sense. The exiles had to be here. The Ravinians were preparing to attack them. And what was I doing? digging a grave, not knowing what to do about any of it. The sun was going down. Though I wasn't in an official graveyard, it still gave me the creeps to be standing in an open grave while shadows grew long. I finished the hole quickly and got the heck out of there. I brought the shovel back to the garage and saw that the wreck of the helicopter was gone. They probably salvaged any parts they could use on their own choppers, then ditched the carcass in one of the surrounding buildings. As I walked to the garage, a door opened. 6 guys came out, carrying a body wrapped tightly in a white cloth. This was going to be Antonio's final journey. The procession went past me. I stood there and bowed my head out of respect. One of the guys came to me and took the shovel. I may have dug the grave, but the job of burying Antonio would be theirs. With a nod of thanks, he rejoined the funeral procession. I watched them for a few moments, then went inside. Mark and Ellie were sitting at a table, among several of the stolen helicopters. He had put out food for her, but Ellie wasn't eating. I wasn't much interested in food either, but I knew we had to eat when we had the chance. I sat down and looked over the feast. It was basically a bunch of canned fruit and vegetables that had been opened and spread out across the scarred wooden table. A single fork was in each can. Mark must have seen the look on my face. He said, "Not exactly the Manhattan Tower Hotel, but it's good. And it's safe. There's a ton of canned food all over the city." "Looks good to me," I said, lying. I picked up the least vile-looking can and scooped out a big chunk of something that looked like half of a peach. At least, I hoped it was half a peach. If it wasn't, I didn't want to know. I popped it into my mouth and tried to swallow it without chewing or tasting it. Not an easy thing to do. It was sweet, that much I could tell. It slid down, and I didn't gag. I hated canned peaches. "Try to eat, Ellie," I said. "You never know when we'll get another chance." She took a couple of sips of water. Mark sat staring at the table. His mind was somewhere else. "Who was he?" I asked. "My best friend," was his answer. He quickly looked up at me and added, "After you, that is. We got shoved into the flume in the Bronx at the same time." "I'm sorry," was all I could say. I didn't think it could even begin to help him feel better. Ellie looked sick, and I didn't think it was because of the canned peaches. She had retreated into herself, hugging her waist in a way that looked as if she were trying to protect herself. As we sat there, I realized there was something we had to talk about. Neither of them were going to like it, but I didn't see any way around it. "Mark, this is Ellie. She's the traveler from Quillen." Mark looked up and nodded politely. I wondered how long it was going to take for him to connect the dots. He smiled at her. Then his face went blank. The smile was gone. The dots had been connected in about 3.2 seconds. "Ellie Winter?" he asked, to confirm. Ellie nodded. "Neva's mother," Mark stated flatly. I had to cut in. "This is Mark Diamond, Ellie. He's been my friend since we were kids. We grew up together on Second Earth." "I know," Ellie said, her voice cracking. "You're the one my daughter's been manipulating." "She's been manipulating a lot of people," Mark shot back. I wasn't sure if he was angry or hurt. I also didn't know how he would relate to Ellie, knowing that her daughter had threatened to kill his parents and generally made his life miserable. It was a tense moment. I didn't know what to say to diffuse it. Ellie took care of it for me. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said kindly. "I've heard a lot about you and how you were tricked into helping Neva. If I could undo the things my daughter has done, I would. It's why we're here." Mark shot me a questioning look. "It's true," I said. "We're scrambling, Mark. I thought Ellie might be able to get through to her daughter." "And do what?" Mark asked sharply. "I don't know," I answered lamely. "Make her see reason, show her another side to this whole thing, maybe even shame her into acting like a human. There's nothing human about that witch, Mark spat. She's heartless. Ellie winced. Mark stood up, throwing back his chair. It clattered to the floor as he walked away from us. I went after him. Whoa, I said, heading him off. I got close to him, speaking softly but with intensity. Ellie didn't need to hear what I was saying. I hear you, I said. I know she's a witch. There are worse words to use. Nobody knows that better than I do except for you, but Ellie isn't Neva. She's a traveler. So what? Neva's a traveler too. I thought about getting into the whole thing about Ellie being Neva's natural mother, but that would have meant explaining to Mark about Solara and the fact that none of the travelers were actually from their home territories. I figured he had enough to deal with. I know, Neva's a traitor. You get no arguments from me, but there were times, you said so yourself, that Neva showed there might be more going on with her. Remember when she forced you into giving up your ring? She threatened to kill my parents. Right. And when you gave it to her, you said she was disappointed, like she'd wanted you to fight for it. Saint Dane wanted that ring. Her mission was to get it, but she was disappointed when you gave it up. Yeah, Mark sniffed. Because she probably wanted to kill my parents. Or maybe she was having second thoughts. I've seen it too, Mark. There might be some humanity in there somewhere. I figured if anybody could find it, it would be her mother. Mark glanced over at Ellie, who sat staring at the table. We have to do something, Mark, I continued. Your friend died trying to get back here to tell you an attack was coming. If those Ravinians are coming after you and the rest of your friends, that's bad enough. But if Saint Dane knows where the rest of the exiles are, the ball game's over. It's all about the exiles, Mark. They are the last best hope to save Halla. Why? How? He asked. I can explain it all to you, but I think it would only make things more confusing. It'd be a lot easier if you just believe me. We have to find those people. We have to make sure they're safe. That includes you and your friends. I think Ellie gives us a shot at doing that. I don't know how else to say it to you. It may be desperate, but it's the only thing I can think of doing. So you're just going to walk up to the gates of that fortress and ask if Neva can come out and play? I don't know. I haven't figured that part out. Mark looked at me and nodded thoughtfully. Did you find Courtney? He asked. No, was my quick answer. She might be with the rest, he said hopefully. Maybe. I hope so. There are a lot of them out there, Mark. We have to find them and protect them. I couldn't tell if I was getting through to him or not. I was asking him to take a lot on faith. He had trusted me since we were kids. I hoped he wouldn't stop. Mark took a tired breath and walked away from me, headed toward Ellie. I watched nervously, not sure of where his head was or what he was planning to do. He knelt down next to her and put his elbow on the table. I'm sorry for saying those things about your daughter, he said with sincerity. Ellie couldn't bring herself to look at him. Don't be, she replied. They're true. When I thought I lost my mother and father, it made me do things I might not ordinarily have done. Neva did lose hers, Ellie replied sadly. Mark nodded. I know how important it was for me to get them back. Maybe it's time to let Neva have her mother back. That struck Ellie. Her gaze lifted from the table. She looked Mark in the eye. He smiled warmly. Ellie gave me a hopeful look, then touched Mark's cheek. I'm sure your mother is very proud of you. It looked to me as if Mark's eyes were filling with tears. She was, he said. I miss them. I can't guarantee that Neva misses me. Mark held her hand and said, Let's find out. He stood up and faced me. I can get you inside the conclave, he announced. There's only one catch. What's that? I'm going with you. Journal number 37, Chapter 21. The plan was to get some sleep and leave before dawn. I'd been going non-stop for who knows how long, and my tank was empty. 2 rooms were set up for sleeping on the second floor of the grimy garage, one for men, the other for women. They each had single mattress beds lined up along the walls. It wasn't exactly cush, but it was far better than what the Batu had at Mourage. At first, I was reluctant to take one of the cots, thinking I'd be displacing somebody. That is, until I remembered that there were a bunch of people who wouldn't be coming back to sleep there that night. Unfortunately, there was plenty of room. I made sure that Ellie was set up and comfortable in the room they had for women. She was there along with 3 others. They saw to it that she had everything she needed, which wasn't much. Soon Ellie was off to sleep. At least, I thought she was. She may have just been closing her eyes, so as not to have to deal with reality. Ellie hadn't said much since we'd arrived on Third Earth. I hoped she was up to the task in front of us. In front of her. If she wasn't, our trip was for nothing. When I finally settled into my own bed, Mark was waiting for me. He wanted answers. The thought of explaining the realities of Halla and Solara to him made me shudder. How would he react to it all? Getting Mark to understand and accept it was a job I didn't look forward to. All I wanted to do was sleep. But he needed to understand why our mission to protect the exiles was so important. Heck, he was an exile himself, and he'd been part of this war as long as I had. He deserved something. I know it all now, Mark, I said as we sat facing each other on our beds. Everything. Though I'm not sure how to explain it to you. Give it a shot, he said, without hesitation. He didn't care that I was exhausted. I didn't blame him. I racked my brain trying to come up with the simplest explanation possible. There's life beyond our own, I began. The spiritual life. The spirit that lives in every person doesn't die when their body does. It moves on and becomes part of a bigger reality that reflects our own. Mark looked at me like I had just said cows could fly. Okay, he said with a huge dose of skepticism. I saw Uncle Press again, and Kasha, and Osa. They're dead, he said flatly. The physical beings they were when they were living in Halla are dead. Their spirit continues on in a place called Solara. An 11th territory? No, it's way more cosmic than that. It's been about Solara from the beginning. Saint Dane is trying to control it, to destroy its spirit. Once he does that, Halla doesn't matter anymore, because he can create his own physical universe, his own Halla. Mark frowned. What? Yeah, this is where it starts getting complicated. Starts? I'd say we're already pretty far down that path. I shrugged. What could I say? You're serious about this? Mark asked tentatively. I nodded. That was a way simple explanation, but yeah. So why are the exiles so important that St. Dane wants them dead? Because after all that happened to Halla, after the dismantling of so many societies and civilizations, they're the last remaining group of people who stood up to Ravinia, to St. Dane. When they were shot off of Second Earth, it was like they were taken out of the loop. They didn't experience the downfall of their own world. It was like St. Dane inadvertently protected them, and now it's their collective spirit that is keeping him from his final victory. The collective spirit of the exiles is keeping Solara alive. Remember how St. Dane kept talking about Pendragon being the first domino to fall? The exiles are the last domino. If they are destroyed, Solara will be his. So, if the Ravinians hadn't sent us all into exile, St. Dane would have won by now? Pretty much. It was the biggest mistake he made. Now he's trying to correct it. And we're counting on it to come back and bite him in the butt. Exactly. The travelers were sent out to find the remaining exiles and protect them. You're one of them, Mark. Courtney, too. Okay. Say you find the other exiles. Then what? Then we move on St. Dane here, on Third Earth. Mark's eyes lit up. That I understand. I thought you would. You think Ellie can convince Neva to help somehow? I rubbed my eyes. It was a point-blank question. I had to give him an answer that was just as direct. No, I don't. Neva's hardcore. But who knows what'll happen when she sees her mother. It might get through to her somehow. Don't count on it, he grumbled. I hear you, but I'll try anything. I don't want to say that I'm desperate, but I'm desperate. Is it worth the risk? Going in there, I mean? You saw what happened to Antonio. I did. And it's another reason I want to get to Neva. Antonio said there was an attack coming. If St. Dane knows where the exiles are, they're dead and Halla is lost. We need to find out what's going on and try to scuttle it. Mark nodded. I knew he was running Antonio's final words over in his head. I had done it 100 times myself. If he's building more gunships to go after the exiles, Mark said, thinking aloud, it means they're probably here on Third Earth. That's what I was thinking. Are there really 70,000 of us? He asked. St. Dane created a massive flume in the middle of a packed Yankee stadium that sucked them all inside. 70,000 might be light. Mark's eyes went wide. I figured he was trying to imagine the event. I, on the other hand, preferred to forget it. Mark said, it's easier to imagine that whole Solara spirit thing than to picture Yankee Stadium being sucked down a drain. Yikes. We looked at each other and laughed. It was totally inappropriate, but it broke the tension. For a second it felt like old times, when Mark and I would hang out for hours and talk about anything that came into our heads. It didn't last long. Mark clapped his hands on his knees and stood up. I'll send my guys out in a chopper at first light. If there are 70,000 people hiding out somewhere, we'll find them. I don't know, I said skeptically. It took St. Dane a while. Yeah, he said slyly. But we know where to look. He strode for the door, then stopped and turned back as if he had a new thought. He squinted, which was something Mark always did when he was having trouble understanding something. I liked those small, familiar moments. It meant that beneath that hardened exterior, my friend was still lurking around somewhere. The flumes were destroyed, right? He asked. Every last one of them. So how did you and Ellie get here? And how are the other travelers getting around? We don't need the flumes anymore. The travelers can go wherever we want anytime. But we have to be careful, because each time we do, it depletes more of the power of Solara. Mark stared at me, still squinting. We stayed like that for a few seconds. I think he went into brain lock. What I had just said went beyond his comprehension. He finally shook his head and said, forget I asked. Forgotten. He didn't move. Something else was on his mind. I hoped he wasn't going to ask me any more questions about Solara. What's the matter? I asked. Besides everything. Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I feel like, one way or another, this is it. I mean, it's finally going to be over, isn't it? It is, one way or another. He nodded. I'm glad we're back together, Bobby. Me too. Courtney should be here. We'll find her, I said with confidence, but absolutely no authority. He pulled himself out of there. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes, hoping for sleep to come quickly. As usual, it didn't. My mind was too full of clashing thoughts, most of which were about what would happen the next day. I'd been on plenty of adventures since becoming a traveler. My journals are loaded with the tales. It had become a way of life, a crazy way of life, but what can you do? That was the way it was meant to be. This time was different. Of all the things I've been through, either alone or with another traveler, we were always able to take care of ourselves, more or less. Not this time. Mark and I were setting out on what could be a suicide mission, with an older woman on our team. The closest I'd come to that was with Gunny, but he could take care of himself. Heck, he could handle himself better than I could. Ellie was a different story. She was smart and resilient, no question there, but she was fragile, physically and emotionally. I wasn't so much worried about something bad happening to her. After all, she was a traveler. but we were going to have to move fast and react to constantly changing threats. Doing that with an older, fragile woman was going to be tricky. Making it worse was the fact that Mark would be with us. He wasn't a traveler. He could die, like really die. And he was an exile. I had to make sure that Mark survived the ordeal while watching out for Ellie and, oh, by the way, staying alive myself. Suddenly my plan didn't seem like such a hot one. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. But I did get to sleep. Finally. My body and my brain needed it. I probably could have slept for days, but all we could afford was a couple of hours. Mark got me up before daybreak. "Come on," was all he had to say. I was up and ready to go in seconds. I followed him quickly and quietly, trying not to wake the other guys who slept in the beds around us. Ellie waited for us in the garage near the helicopters. She had changed into nondescript gray pants and a black shirt. Standard wear for Third Earth. She stood stiffly, with her arm still wrapped around her waist. Her long gray hair was pulled back tight out of the way. I'm not sure if it was the way her hair was or the light, but for the first time I saw the resemblance between her and Neva. She stood up straight. Her eyes were alert, just like her daughter. They were definitely blood relatives. I still had all my Second Earth clothes, and Mark had on the same raggedy pants and shirt I'd seen him wear that day he rescued those people from the building in the zoo. That seemed like years ago. For all I knew, it was years ago. I'd lost all sense of time. Mark had 3 short jet-black guns that looked like miniature shotguns. The single barrels were wide. Beneath each was a thick, round disc where, I assumed, the ammunition was stored. Not that I was an expert, but it was like no gun I'd ever seen. "These were stolen from the fortress," Mark explained. "It fires some sort of burst of charged particles. It's enough to knock a big guy off his feet, but it won't kill him. What it kills are dados. One shot, and they go cold." He kept one and gave one each to Ellie and me. I held the weapon up, admiring it. "I love this," I said in awe. "I've never fired a weapon in my life," Ellie said, holding the gun as if it were diseased. "Be sure to hold the stock tight against your body, or the recoil might hurt you," Mark explained. "Each has 10 shots. After that, it's done. We don't have reloads." Ellie looked sick. I wasn't even sure she knew which end to point at a dado. I took the gun from her. "It's okay. You won't have to do any shooting," I assured her. She looked relieved. Not relaxed, but relieved. I hadn't fired many guns either, but to be honest, the idea of nailing a couple of dados appealed to me. I didn't want to go looking for one, but if I had one in my sights, I didn't think I'd have any trouble pulling the trigger. The guns had shoulder straps, so I slung both weapons over my back. "What's the plan?" I asked Mark. He led us out of the garage to where one of the other exiles, a girl with red hair and freckles, named Maddie, was waiting behind the wheel of an ancient yellow taxi. She didn't look any older than 16. I wondered if she had her driver's license, though I doubted if anybody checked anymore. Just so long as she knew how to drive, I didn't care. We hurried into the back seat, slammed the door, and Maddie hit the gas. With a lurch, we were off and flying. Fast. She knew how to drive. Mark explained. "We have to get to the insert point before the sun comes up. Moving cars in daylight draw attention." "Insert point?" I asked. "The city is honeycombed with ancient tunnels," Mark said, "at all levels. They carried subways, sewage, electricity, pretty much everything that made a city work and that nobody wanted to see. There's a whole city below this city that most people never saw." "It's still intact?" I asked. "Most of it collapsed when the fireworks started. That's what they tell me, anyway. But the deeper tunnels survived, and we have maps. They're like gold. It's how everybody moves around without being seen by Ravinians." "People live underground?" Ellie asked. "Some do, but mostly the tunnels are used as highways. There's a service tunnel that runs directly beneath the Ravinian fortress. They have no idea it exists. We don't use it that often because we don't want to risk it being discovered and ruining the one advantage we have over them. But every once in a while, we stage a quiet raid, like the one that got these guns. We're able to get right under their noses without them knowing."
Ellie asked, "Is that how Antonio got to the fortress?"
Mark nodded. I didn't want to dwell on that last mission. "Do you know the factory he was talking about?" I asked. "Yeah, it's outside the fortress. It's a huge place where they assemble the choppers. I think it's where they store weapons, too. I don't know for sure, though. I've never been inside. Nobody has."
"Except for Antonio," Ellie corrected.
"We should go there first," I said. "I want to see what Antonio was talking about. We have to know what we're up against." "Done. I can get us in." "Great. Tricky part is getting out again." "Oh." On that depressing thought, we all fell quiet. Maddie drove us quickly through the dead streets of Manhattan. It was a hairy ride. Our car didn't have headlights, and there were no streetlights burning, so it was hard to make out where the streets ended and the sidewalks or buildings began. That didn't stop Maddie. She charged down the streets and took corners as if she were wearing night vision goggles. For the record, she wasn't. It was scaring the hell out of me. But I wasn't about to be a backseat driver. All I could do was dig my fingernails into the armrest and prepare for the jolt when we hit something. We didn't, though I'm not sure why. Maddie pulled up to a 2-story brick building that had no signage or markings. She hit the brakes, skidded to a stop, and looked back at us with a quick, "Go, good luck." "You too," Mark told her. "That was great driving," I said to Maddie, trying to make friends.
"You should see what I can do in a helicopter," she replied with a sly smile.
I didn't necessarily want to experience that particular pleasure. If she flew like she drove, I'd probably pass out from fear. Mark said, "Maddie's flying the first leg to search for the exiles." "Oh," I said quickly. "Then good luck to you too." She winked. We all got out of the car. Maddie barely waited until I closed the door before taking off. She shot down the dark street, took a sharp corner, and was gone. She had to get back before sunrise. These people lived like vampires. Mark wasn't wasting time either. He walked straight into the building. We followed. Of course, the place was empty. I had no idea what it might have been used for, but if it was sitting over the entrance to an underground utility tunnel, it was probably a city building of some sort. Mark led us quickly across the empty floor that was covered with broken bits of furniture, glass, and I don't know what else. He knew exactly where he was going. I had Ellie walk in front of me so I could keep an eye on her. Mark led us through a few doors to a stairwell that disappeared down into the dark. Ellie hesitated. "If Mark says it's okay, I said, trying to reassure her. Mark looked back and said, "This is the easy part." That didn't make me feel any better, which meant it probably did even less for Ellie. But like I said, she was brave. We followed Mark down several flights of winding concrete stairs. After passing through another doorway, we came upon another stairwell. The deeper we went, the darker it became. "Are we going to be walking the whole way in the dark?" I asked. "Wait," Mark answered. We had finally reached bottom. At least I thought it was the bottom. I didn't see any other stairways around. I didn't see much of anything. It was nearly pitch black. Ellie had a death grip on my arm. Mark shuffled over to a far wall, moving slowly so as not to walk face first into something. He ran his hands along the wall until he came upon what looked like a box mounted there. He opened it, reached inside, threw a switch, and we had light. A line of overhead bulbs lit up an impossibly long tunnel that stretched out to either side of us. Dark pipes ran the length of the tunnel for as far as I could see. It was dizzying. We were standing at the foot of metal stairs, surrounded by electric juncture boxes. "The survivors tapped the electricity that powers the Ravinians' underground train," Mark explained. "It's one of the advantages of living like a shadow." "Yeah, no electric bills," I said.
making a lame joke. Nobody laughed. "This is the insert point that's closest to the fortress," Mark said. "I've made this trip only once, but it's not like we can get lost. We've got about a mile to go." He turned right and started walking. Ellie followed him, and I followed Ellie. It was tough getting my bearings after that breakneck cab ride, courtesy of our night guide named Matty. I figured that if we were headed toward the Ravinian fortress, then we were walking under the river. That was kind of creepy. But if this ancient tunnel had lasted through multiple centuries and a devastating war, the odds of it collapsing and trapping us were pretty slim. We didn't say much on our journey. I think we had all retreated into our own heads to prepare for whatever we might find on the other side. Every so often we'd come upon an area where the tunnel widened. These areas seemed to be where connections were made and service people worked. Kind of like crossroads. I could see that these areas had been used as homes. There were crusty, crumpled-up blankets, empty cans of food, and some long-forgotten books. "Did the homeless live down here?" I asked. Mark didn't even look back when he answered, "We're all homeless, Bobby." "Oh, right." I started getting a clearer picture of what life was like for the non-Ravinians on Third Earth. They were in constant fear of being discovered by the Ravinians and lived like rats. They kept to the dark tunnels and could only move around without fear at night. They really were like vampires. "So sad," was the only comment Ellie made. It wasn't much, but I was glad to hear that she hadn't checked out completely. Her head was with us in the moment. Our journey took about half an hour. It felt endless, since there wasn't much to look at. We reached another juncture point, where the only difference between it and all the others was a painted symbol on the cement wall. It was a crudely drawn red star. The star that marked the gates. The Ravinian star. Mark saw that I was staring at it. "We painted that to mark the spot," Mark explained. "Kinda fits, don't you think?" I nodded. I knew what he meant. Every trip I had taken through Halla had begun at a spot that was marked by a star. This time would be no different. Mark continued. "Going up here would get us into the conclave. You want to start here or check out the chopper factory?" "I want to see what Antonio saw," was my answer. "Then we keep moving." Mark led us another few hundred yards until we came to another juncture, our last. A narrow metal ladder led up into the unknown. "This is where it gets risky," Mark explained. "This is the route we sent Antonio's team on. The maps show that this comes up outside the fortress wall, next to the factory. We're going to climb up to a manhole that's buried under dirt and rubble. The thing is, there's no way to know if a Ravinian guard is standing nearby until we lift it up." "So we might climb up into the middle of a bunch of dados?" I asked. "Yep, pretty much. This is outside the fortress, but it's inside their security perimeter. They don't expect anybody to be popping up out of the dirt, so if we run into somebody, it'll be bad luck." "And what if our luck is bad?" I asked. "Then we come out shooting." I had to smile at my friend's bold statement. He hadn't only grown up, he'd become a gorilla. "Are you sure you're Mark Diamond?" I asked. He laughed. "I haven't been sure of anything for years. You guys ready?" I looked to Ellie. She nodded. Mark went to another electric panel. "Gotta kill the lights. Too risky to leave them burning. Put your hands on the ladder." Ellie and I grabbed the ladder and Mark threw the switch. It was a good thing we were holding the ladder because the juncture went pitch black. I couldn't see an inch ahead of me. We would have bumped into one another looking for the ladder in the dark. "Me first, then Bobby," Mark commanded. I sensed him move past us and up the ladder. "You gonna be okay?" I asked Ellie. "I'm fine down here," was her answer. "It's what's outside that has me worried." That made 3 of us. We all climbed up, and up, and up.
We kept reaching higher levels where we transferred to other ladders. Luckily, the ambient light grew as we got nearer the surface, so it wasn't like climbing through ink. I kept glancing back, afraid that Ellie might freeze, but she was right there with us. No problem. So far, she was rising to the occasion. We hit yet another level, and Mark waited for us to join him.
"This is it," he whispered. "The manhole is at the top of this next ladder. I'll go up and push the cover. Bobby, you stay behind me, but keep your eyes down. Dirt's gonna fall. Once I'm up, I'll check to see if it's clear, then call for you guys to follow."
"I should go first," I suggested. "This was my idea." I was actually thinking that if we were to climb up under the feet of some dados, I didn't want them to get Mark.
"Sorry, I'm calling the shots here."
He cuffed me on the arm.
"Besides, I can't let anything happen to the lead traveler."
I wanted to tell him that he didn't have to worry, but it was clear that his mind was made up.
"Fine. What do we do once we're on top?"
Mark shrugged.
"Beats me. The map only gets us to here. After that, we wing it."
I turned to Ellie and said,
"Stay down here on the platform. We'll call for you to come up."
Ellie nodded and backed away from the ladder.
"Ready?"
Mark asked. I hitched the two guns up onto my shoulder and nodded. Mark scrambled right up the ladder. I followed close behind. In no time, he was at the top. I leaned back and looked up to see the circular outline of the manhole cover. Mark waved for me to look away. I waved back for him to keep going and not worry about me. He shrugged and raised a hand up to the circle. Manhole covers are heavy to begin with, and if this thing was covered with dirt, it must have weighed a ton. I saw Mark strain to push with one hand. It barely budged. He had to use both hands, which wasn't easy while balancing on a ladder. He climbed up one rung higher so he could use his legs as well. Yet again I was amazed at how much my friend had changed. He was now a powerful, confident guy. I hoped he was powerful enough to get us the heck out of there. I was about to climb up to see if I could help when I felt the first trickle of dirt fall in my eyes. I looked away, and not a second too soon, because Mark had the cover in motion, and a load of dirt hit me on my head. I saw Ellie on the platform looking up. She had to step back to avoid getting hit with the dirt shower. The sound of metal raking across metal meant that Mark was pushing the cover aside. More dirt fell on my head, but I didn't care. I wanted out of there, fast. If there were any dados hanging around, we were in the worst possible position. The scraping stopped, and so did the cascade of dirt. I took a chance and looked up to see a crescent of gray sky. Mark didn't waste time admiring the sight. He popped his head up and did a quick 360 around.
"Bring her up,"
he whispered down to me. I looked down to Ellie and motioned for her to climb. By the time I looked back up, Mark was already gone. I climbed quickly and squeezed myself through the sliver of an opening. Mark was right next to me, on his belly, his head near the open manhole.
"Stay down,"
he whispered.
"It's clear, but who knows for how long."
I scrambled out and got down on the ground next to Mark. The whole world looked gray, mostly because of the early morning light that comes before the warm rays of the sun sneak over the horizon. We were in a wide alley between two high walls that ran parallel to each other. One, I realized, was the outer wall of the Ravinian fortress. It towered high over us like a skyscraper. I guessed that we were a couple of 100 yards back from the front wall where the huge doors were. This wall had no doors, or windows, or anything. It was a sheer stone facade that looked more like a giant dam than a wall. About 30 yards across from the fortress was the wall of another building. This wasn't anywhere near as tall. I'd say it was about 4 stories high, but it was still pretty huge. We were maybe 50 yards from the front of this building, but it stretched back the other way for several hundred more. I looked at the massive building, then to Mark. He nodded. He knew what I was thinking.
"Yeah,"
he whispered.
"the factory."
The best news was that there wasn't a dado in sight. We had made it through what Mark thought was the riskiest part of the trip. I had no doubt there would be plenty of risks ahead to make up for it. Ellie poked her head up out of the hole. Mark and I quickly helped her out. After she was safely up, we struggled to push the manhole back into place and brushed dirt over it to hide our tracks. The ground between the walls was nothing but dirt, which made it easy to rebury the cover. We made sure to spread the dirt around enough to disguise the manhole. If somebody was looking for it, they'd probably find it, but if a random dado walked by, I was confident they wouldn't uncover anything. The whole time we were disguising the manhole, I was thinking how there was no way we'd be able to use it to get out of there, especially if we had to find it in a hurry. When it was time to get back to the city, we were going to have to find another route. Mark was already scanning the building, looking for a way in. There were no windows in this wall either. No way to get a quick peek inside. It looked to me like the little brother of the much larger Ravinian conclave across from it. There was a set of double doors near the front of the building. Next to the doors was a metal ladder that ran up to the roof. We didn't need to discuss it. This was where we had to go. I looked to Ellie. She nodded that she was okay, but her eyes were wild. She was scared. I was afraid that she was barely holding it together. I motioned for Mark to go first. He jumped up and scampered to the wall of the factory and the double doors. I held Ellie's arm and helped her run after him. My other hand was on the straps of the two rifles. I'd have preferred to have one of them pointed and ready, but I couldn't do that, hold the other strap, and guide Ellie all at the same time. I had to trust that if a shot needed to be taken quickly, Mark would take it. We got to the door in seconds. Mark tried it. It was locked.
I guess that would have been too easy,
he said with a shrug. He tried to force it open. No go. I looked at the ladder. We could climb, or we could head around the corner of this building to look for another door. I'm thinking that the longer we spend sneaking around, the better chance we'll be seen. Mark didn't wait for any other opinions. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and climbed the ladder. One more climb, I said to Ellie with a weak smile. She went right after Mark. I was last in line. Climbing this ladder was hairier than any of the others. For one, we were totally exposed. Anybody coming by would spot us in a nanosecond. It was scary, too. Underground, it was safe and closed. Out here, we clung to the side of a building with nothing around us but air. We probably would have hurt just as badly if we had fallen when we were down below, but being out in the open made this seem much more dangerous. I guess it's like the difference between walking a tightrope that's 2 inches off the ground or 30 feet up. I made a point of not looking down. We made it to the top with no problem. When I reached the lip and stepped onto the flat roof, I gasped. I actually gasped. The building was huge. Seeing one side wall didn't give the full perspective. Up on top, we could see the whole thing, and there was a lot to see. The roof was completely flat, broken up by various air ducts and skylights that dotted the surface. From the front corner, we could pretty much see to the far side. It was a long way away. The building was probably twice as long as it was wide. It was an enormous, sprawling structure. You can make a whole lot of helicopters here, I pointed out. I guess you need a lot to hunt down 70,000 people, Mark added. Let's go see, I said, and jogged off. We were totally exposed up there, but what else could we do? I ran toward the closest skylight, hoping it would give us access. The glass window looked like a small greenhouse structure on top of the flat roof. I got there first and peered down for my first look inside. Sure enough, there were several rows of gleaming black, brand-spanking new helicopters lined up, ready to fly. Each had rocket launchers in front. These choppers were assault weapons, no doubt about it. Ellie and Mark joined me and looked down. Wow, Mark exclaimed. Armed for bear, too. It's monstrous, Ellie gasped, numb. A few feet beyond the skylight, I spotted a hatch with a handle. I grabbed the metal loop and pulled. The hatch opened. "I guess they don't expect anybody dropping in from up here," I remarked. Inside the building, another small ladder led down to a metal catwalk. I climbed down first, then helped Ellie. The catwalk ran along the wall, high above the factory floor. From inside, we could look down to see the entire fleet of choppers, or whatever it is you call a bunch of helicopters. They were all new. They were all armed. They were all ready for their deadly mission. "Look," Mark said. "They're making even more." He pointed to the far side of the space, where we saw several more helicopters in various stages of construction. "Yikes! How many do they think they need?" Mark asked. 70,000 people is a lot of people," was my sober answer. I scanned the vast factory floor, trying to take it all in. It was then that something struck me. "This might get worse," I announced. Mark said, "Worse than a few dozen attack helicopters armed with rockets? I mean, this isn't the whole factory." I pointed to the right, which was the direction the building had stretched out before us when we were on the roof. "What we're seeing here isn't even half the factory. Look at the far wall. No way that's the end of the building. There's more beyond that. A lot more." "Could there be even more helicopters?" Ellie asked. I saw that the catwalk continued on along the wall, high above the factory floor. "Let's find out," I said, and moved quickly along the metal walkway. I took one of the guns off my shoulder and held it against my hip, ready to shoot. I kept glancing to the factory floor to see if any workers or dados might be down there to sound an alarm. The place seemed deserted. I figured it might have been a day off. Did dados take a day off? Or maybe it was too early for the first shift to begin. After all, the sun had barely come up. We passed row after row of the attack helicopters. I was already planning some way to sabotage them. Maybe the rockets on board could be fired, and that would create a chain reaction, or something. We had to figure out some way of grounding this fleet of killing machines. We made the long walk to the far wall, and to a door that would lead us to whatever was beyond. I grabbed the door handle and turned. It was unlocked. I turned back to the others. "You think we can do some damage down there?" I asked Mark. Mark shrugged. "I don't see why not. There's plenty of live ammo around. Of course, if we start making noise, they'll know we're here." "You think?" I chuckled. I opened the door, stepped into the next factory space, and all thoughts of helicopters left my head. I dropped the rifle. That's how stunned I was. My arms went limp. The weapon clattered onto the metal walkway. I left it there, taking a few dazed steps forward, as if getting closer might make the image before me clearer and prove it wasn't what it seemed to be. I hoped it was an optical illusion, or a trick, or anything other than what it looked to be. There was a question I'd often wondered about but never bothered to try and answer. Since leaving home, I had to learn about and understand so many impossible things that some of them I just had to let go. It's how I felt about unique technology on all the territories. I never really wondered or cared about how they created power on Ibera, or how the air globes of Chloral were created, or what advanced technology would allow something like lifelight to exist, or the amber crystals on Elon that carried radio signals. These were all aspects of the territories that were interesting but didn't need to be analyzed unless it could help us on our mission. The same held true for what we saw on that factory floor. This is what Antonio and his team had discovered. This is what he meant when he said the Ravinians had been preparing to attack. It had nothing to do with helicopters. The factory did indeed go on. This second section had to be 3 times the size of the area that held the choppers. The lame choppers. The choppers that now seemed like toys compared to what faced us on that factory floor. I now had the answer to a question I had never asked. I now knew where the dados were made. We stood above a sea of thousands of dado warriors, shoulder to shoulder, heel to toe, row upon perfect row. They were dressed in various uniforms. Some wore the green military-like uniforms with gold helmets from Quillen. Another whole section had on the deep red suits that showed them to be Ravinian guards. One huge section held dados that didn't have uniforms, but instead were dressed in normal clothing that would easily allow them to blend in with the people of Second Earth. There was more. I saw dados dressed as Batu warriors and Bedouin knights. Some wore the rags that made them look like flighters from Iberra. Maybe the most jarring of all was the section of Clees. They actually made dado cats. As with the helicopters, one whole section of floor was an assembly line that held hundreds of dados that were yet to be completed. There were more to come, many more. I saw multiple rows of legs and arms and hands, all waiting to be used to create more robotic warriors. The dados all had the same blank expression. Many were still made in Mark's image, but others branched out with different looks. The dados were looking more human than ever. But they weren't. They were machines. They were St. Dane's army. "This is what Antonio found," I said with a dry mouth. "This is how they're going to attack." Mark looked just as stunned as I felt. "There could be 70,000 exiles or 700,000. It won't matter. They can't stand up to this army." I went into brain lock. I didn't know what to do. About the dados, about Halla, about the exiles. I didn't even know what to do in the next second. I was frozen. Whoomp! A dull but powerful sound tore through the dead quiet. An instant later, a dado that had been creeping toward us along the catwalk fell off and plummeted to the factory floor. It looked like a mannequin because it was already dead. It hit, bounced, and crumpled like a doll. Mark and I both looked back in surprise to see Ellie standing behind us with the gun I had dropped. She had it braced against her hip, her finger on the trigger. She had dropped the dado with a single shot. "Pick up your guns," she commanded with confidence. "They know we're here." Journal number 37, Chapter 22. I don't know what was more stunning, finding the vast army of dados, knowing that we had been discovered and were in for a fight, or seeing Ellie with a rifle on her hip after having blown away a dado. I think it was Ellie. "Move!" she barked. Mark and I both jumped to the side of the narrow walkway as Ellie unloaded again. She shot from the hip, literally. She held the weapon at waist level, the butt against her hip. The rifle let out another dull whoomp as it discharged. For a fleeting instant, I thought I sensed the charged particle as it shot past us. Maybe I'm crazy, but I could swear the hair went up on the back of my neck, as if I had been brushed by static electricity. A second later, another dado was blown off its feet. It landed square on its back on the metal walkway. Dead. Done. Lights out. Whatever. Farther ahead on the catwalk, more dados in red Ravinian outfits appeared and sprinted toward us. "Back to the roof," I commanded. We turned to run back the way we had come. Ellie led the way, her rifle out and ready to fire again. Who knew? We got as far as the doorway that led back into the helicopter section of the factory when Ellie pulled up. "They must have seen us on the roof," she gasped. Sure enough, on the far side of the chopper factory, a dozen dados came flooding down the same ladder we had used to get down from the roof. We were trapped between two groups who were closing fast. 28 shots left," Mark said coolly. "What if there's 29 of them?" I asked. "There's 29,000 of them," Mark exclaimed. "Climb down," Ellie announced. Without waiting for our opinions, Ellie scrambled for a ladder no more than 10 feet ahead of us that led down to the factory floor. She swung the rifle over her shoulder as if she had done it 1,000 times before, and quickly made her way down the ladder. Mark looked at me with surprise, as if to ask, who woke her up? I shot past Mark and went for the ladder. The catwalk was high over the factory floor. The narrow ladder ran straight down with nothing around it but air. If we hadn't been on the run, I'm not so sure I'd have been able to climb down as quickly as I was. One slip and it would be over. As much as I didn't want to look down, this time I had to. We had to know if any bad boys were arriving below. I looked out over the sea of dados and my stomach flipped. It was like descending into a tank of piranhas. There were thousands of them. It was insanity. We were running away from a handful of dados toward an entire army. At least the army hadn't been activated. I hoped that they were no more dangerous than statues. My foot slipped off a rung. I had to clutch the sides of the thin metal ladder or I would have fallen through. It was a dumb mistake. I was more worried about what we would find on the floor than about getting there safely. I had to force myself to look ahead and concentrate on my footing. One step at a time. Don't worry about the dados. There would be time for that soon enough. I met Ellie on the ground, followed shortly after by Mark. We all had our guns out and ready. But ready for what?
"They're coming down,"
Mark announced. A quick look up showed that the dados from the roof had reached the ladder and were coming after us. The dados already on the catwalk were getting closer. I was happy to see that they didn't have weapons. At least they couldn't take shots at us from the high ground. "Are you okay?" Ellie asked me. She was focused and in control. "I'm fine," I said, a little embarrassed. It made me realize that Ellie wasn't the frail old lady I thought she was. What's that saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going? Well, Ellie was on her way. "We've got to find another way out of here," Mark announced. The two groups of dados were about to join up and descend on us. I looked around, but there wasn't an obvious way out. It became very clear, very fast, that there was only one thing to do. "Needle in a haystack," I declared. Mark looked at the sea of dados and smiled. He got it.
"Right."
"What does that mean?" Ellie asked.
"We'll get lost in the dados," I said. "Come on."
The three of us ran for the army. They may have been dados, but they looked like people. And there were thousands of them. Some even looked like Mark. My hope was to get far enough into the ranks so that the dados who were after us wouldn't know which way we had gone. It seemed like the best way to buy a little time until we could find a way out of that factory. The three of us plunged into the line of robots, barely grazing them as we moved as quickly and quietly as we could, without knocking any of them over. We all knew enough not to speak. That would have defeated the purpose and given us away. Without planning it, we relied on hand signals. Mark was on my right, Ellie on my left. I took the lead and motioned for Mark to start moving diagonally toward the right. We made our way along, one dado width apart from one another. We didn't even have to duck down because the dados were all at least a few inches taller than I was, and I was the tallest of the three of us. Still, I crouched a little, just in case. In seconds, we were deep among the dados. I looked back to see if we were being followed. I was sure that we were, but they would have no way of tracking us. I didn't relax, but we had bought a little breathing room. Moving through the field of dados was one of the eeriest things I had ever done. Dados weren't human, but they sure looked like it. They were inactive, but looked as if they could spring to life at any second. I tried not to look at them too closely. I pretended they were statues and we were running through a museum. A really twisted museum where the exhibits might suddenly jump us. Sheesh, thinking like that wasn't helpful. We kept moving quickly, putting as much space between us and our pursuers as possible. Every so often I motioned for everyone to change direction slightly so we weren't moving in a straight line. The idea was to make it as tough as possible to track us. When I felt as if we were roughly in the middle of the Dado Sea, I motioned for the others to stop. I put my fingers to my lips to be sure they stayed quiet. We stood stock still and listened. I wanted to know where the pursuing dados were. Strangely, we didn't hear anything. Had they stopped chasing us? From where we were, we could see up to the catwalk. It was empty, They were definitely on the factory floor, but where? I got paranoid. Our plan was to hide ourselves among the dados, but it worked both ways. If the robots chasing us got close, we wouldn't see them until they were almost on us. They could be anywhere. They could be hiding from us as much as we were hiding from them, and we might not know they were on top of us until it was too late. We may have been like needles in a haystack, but they were like needles in a stack of needles. I scanned around, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing. I motioned for the others to keep moving, but slowly. After a few more zigzagging steps, we came upon an open space where no dados were lined up. It looked to me like the spot where the dados first came off the assembly line. There was a conveyor belt that led down and under the floor to somewhere else. The space was ringed by silent dados who wore the dark green uniforms of the dados from Quillen, complete with golden helmets. They circled the open area, all facing the center, pointed at us. It made my skin crawl. When Mark saw the conveyor belt, he smiled. He was thinking the same thing I was. We might be able to follow the belt out of there. Wherever it would take us, it would be better than where we were, since we couldn't hide from the dados forever. I got Ellie's attention and pointed to the belt. She nodded. That was our way out. We made our move for the opening that led down below when I quickly held my hand up, stopping everyone again. I had sensed something. Some movement. I did a 360 and saw nothing but the ring of inactive mute dados, but I knew I had sensed something. It was fleeting, and I had only caught it out of the corner of my eye, but it was real. My Mirage training was telling me so. Something was there. But where? Were there dados just outside this clearing, stalking us, getting ready to pounce? I stood stock still. I wasn't looking for anything, so much as trying to sense something. It happened again. This time I was ready for it. The movement wasn't on the floor. It was above us. I looked up quickly to see what looked to be a control room that hung down from the ceiling. It was an octagon with glass windows surrounding it. It would be easy to see the entire dado factory floor from up there, and that's exactly what the person inside was doing. There was a dark figure inside, looking down on us. I couldn't tell who or what it was, but it was definitely active, and I had no doubt that it was looking right at us. Mark and Ellie saw where I was looking and looked up as well. We all froze. What was this guy going to do? Sound an alarm? Direct the pursuing dados to our position? I didn't want to stick around to find out. "Let's go," I commanded. The need for secrecy was over. We ran for the conveyor belt and the hole that would take us below. We didn't make it. No sooner did we start to run than the lights in the control room came on. I guess he didn't feel the need for secrecy anymore either. He also didn't feel the need to tell the few dados who were chasing us where we were. That was because he had plenty more to take their place. All around us, the green-suited dados came to life. 1 second they were standing like statues, the next their heads slowly turned and looked at us. "It's the dado control room," Mark gasped. "He's turning them on." The horrible truth of those words took a second to sink in. Whoever was up in that control room was doing just that, controlling. It was Dado Central. He had the ability to activate the dados. There were thousands of them, and all we had left were 28 shots. The dados closed in, and we opened fire. "Go for the ones near the conveyor," I ordered. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. All three of us let loose. The kick was a lot stronger than I expected. Each time I pulled the trigger, the gun bucked and punched me in the hip. The air instantly felt charged with electricity. Dados crumpled one after the other. Ellie was just as aggressive as Mark and I. She kept her rifle close to her hip and her eyes on her quarry, which wasn't hard because there were plenty of them. "Keep moving!" Mark shouted. The dados weren't armed. If they had been, it would have been over in seconds. Even without weapons, our only hope was to keep them off of us long enough to escape down into the hole. Mark and Ellie concentrated on the dados near the conveyor. I spun around and fired at those who were creeping up from behind. Whoomp, whoomp. They fell, one after another. No sooner did one fall than two more came to life, turned, and moved toward us. It was like something out of Night of the Living Dead, except the dados weren't going to eat us. At least I didn't think they were. We were moving closer to the conveyor tunnel, but not by much. "If you can travel, get out of here," Mark shouted at us. No way that would happen. I couldn't leave Mark to the wolves. But Ellie didn't need to be there. "Go," I said to Ellie. "Back to Solara." Ellie ignored me and kept firing. It was like she was possessed. She had a steely look in her eye that reminded me of her daughter. She was scared, no doubt, but it also seemed like she was taking some pleasure in blowing the dados away. She had been through a lot. Maybe she was taking some small measure of revenge. Whatever it was, she wasn't leaving. "Ellie, go!" She gave me a quick look and shouted, "We're almost there!" She backed toward the opening in the floor, firing as she went. There wasn't time to argue. Dados were closing in on her from the other side of the conveyor belt. I spun and fired to keep them back. Aim wasn't all that important. The charged particles that these weapons fired seemed to fan out like buckshot. Close was close enough. I dropped a dado with one shot and saw a second fall at the same time. I fired again and dropped two more, but we were running out of ammunition and time. Ellie's gun emptied first. Without hesitation, she dropped the weapon, turned to jump into the hole, and was blown off her feet by a shot from another weapon that was fired from somewhere else. She let out a sharp gasp, as if she had been punched in the stomach. She hurtled backward and hit the floor, hard, square on her back. I think she was unconscious before she landed. I had the brief feeling of relief that she hadn't been turned to cinder. Whatever hit her, it wasn't the same kind of charge that we had seen from the silver weapons in the Taj Mahal. But where had it come from? I glanced up to the control tower to see someone inside with a rifle up and on his shoulder, leaning out of an open window like a sniper. No doubt he was the guy who shot Ellie, and he was swinging the rifle toward me. I lifted my own weapon quickly and fired off 3 quick shots. I didn't worry about aim. The sight of Ellie being so violently thrown by a shot from that guy made me lose it. I wanted him to suffer. One of the windows of the control tower exploded from my first shot. The second hit the guy and knocked him back into the control room. The third blasted out a second window. As I ran to help Ellie, I yelled to Mark, "Jump in the hole!" Mark was out of ammunition. He fired 2 more times with no result, then threw his rifle at the approaching dados. No sooner did it leave his hands than he was knocked off his feet by another shot. I looked back up to the control tower to see another sniper leaning out of one of the windows I had shattered. Unlike his pal, he didn't hesitate to admire his marksmanship. By the time I looked up, he was already aiming at me. I was staring square into the barrel of one of those black weapons. I lifted my own. Whoomp! I never fired. I didn't get the chance. My entire body went rigid. It felt like being tasered by the Ravinian guards when Alder and I arrived at the Sherwood mansion on Second Earth. I'm sure I hit the floor, but I don't remember it, because an instant after feeling the jolt, I was unconscious. Waking up from being rudely separated from consciousness is never easy. I should know. It's happened to me often enough. There's that initial feeling of disconnection, followed by the pain of whatever event caused the lights to go out, followed by the desperate need to understand exactly where I had landed and what situation I'd have to deal with. This time was no different. Once I started becoming aware of my surroundings, the first thing I realized was that I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. Not a pinky. I didn't panic. I hadn't pulled far enough away from the land of the unconscious to feel as if it were anything permanent. I had been through this enough times to know I had to bring my brain back online before I could expect it to control my body. One thing was clear. I may have been the illusion that St. Dane said I was, but at that moment, my body felt all too real. I hurt every bit as much as if I'd been born in Stony Brook, Connecticut, instead of in some alternate universe filled with spirits. At that moment, I kind of wished I was a little more spirit-like and a little less human-like. I opened my eyes and tried to focus. There wasn't a dado in sight, which meant I was no longer in that factory. I was flat on my back and looking up at a ceiling covered with white tiles. Was this a hospital? It didn't seem like a prison. I moved my head, which meant I wasn't paralyzed. At least not from the neck up, anyway. Mark was lying next to me, still unconscious. Someone had covered us with dark green blankets. I saw that we were lying on thin mats and not directly on the floor. That was good. At least we were being treated semi-okay. I felt control slowly returning. I twisted my head around to see that we were in a large, empty room. Windows were set high near the ceiling. There would be no way to get out that way. The walls were covered with ornate tiles that created mosaic patterns. If this was a prison, it was a fancy one. I rolled my head the other way and saw that someone was standing by the only door. Neva Winter. "You'll be fine," she said without compassion. "The effects are temporary, which is better than what those weapons do to the dados. Where did you get them, by the way?" Neva wore a dark outfit that kind of reminded me of St. Dane's black suit, but not quite as severe-looking. She had a cloth belt that tied at the waist and an open collar. It looked more like a dark warm-up suit. Her hair was tied back, too, which was different from the way she'd worn it on Quillen. This was more casual and made her look almost human. Still, she had those piercing eyes that made me remember just how cold and calculating she could be. "Water?" she asked. Ellie. Where was Ellie? I forced myself up to my elbows and scanned the room. Another body was lying against a far wall. Her face was covered, but I saw the end of Ellie's gray ponytail poking out from beneath the blanket that was over her. She was here, but still unconscious. I hoped that the effects of the blast hadn't hurt her. "No," I answered. Neva walked toward me. "Why did you come back?" I put on my best smile. "I missed you." Neva didn't appreciate the sarcasm. She glared at me. "It's over, Pendragon," she said with a touch of impatience. "Halla has fallen. Anything that you and the travelers do now is futile." "So then you won't mind that we hang around a little longer," I replied. "You can do whatever you like, but why would you bring Mark here and put him in jeopardy? That's just irresponsible. He's your friend." I gave her a surprised look and said, "Wow, do you really care?" Neva grimaced and turned away. It struck me that she hadn't said anything about Ellie. Did she even know that her mother was lying only a few feet away? It didn't seem like it. "Leave, Pendragon," Neva said. "Take your friends with you and find someplace safe for them to live." She said your friends. She didn't know that Ellie was one of them. I had to figure out a way to use that to our advantage. I also had to figure out a way to learn what Neva knew about the exiles. "Sorry," I said. "Monkeying with St. Dane is a hard habit to break. I think I'll keep at it." "But it's over," she repeated, with a touch of frustration. "Surely you understand that. You're fighting a war that has ended. The territories are no longer. Every world in Halla has been cleansed. There's nothing left to do now but rebuild." I sat up. "Cleansed? Is that what you call it? What you mean is that the people St. Dane considers worthy are living the life, and everybody else has either been killed or will be soon." "We have rewarded excellence," Neva said patiently. "That has been the vision from the beginning. Nothing has happened to the rest of the people of Halla that they didn't bring about themselves." "You're kidding, right? St. Dane manipulated the people of 7 worlds into making decisions that led to their own destruction, and you're saying it's their fault? That's like pushing a puppy out into traffic and saying it was his own fault that he got hit by a car. Give me a break." Neva took a breath. She was trying to control her emotions. "I know you don't feel that a guided future is right. You believe that people should be free to choose their own destiny. But time and again the people of Halla have chosen poorly. and not just where St. Dane was involved. The people of Halla were flawed, and I have no doubt that if St. Dane never intervened, their destruction would have occurred anyway. This way, we have separated those who are worthy of rebuilding Halla and protected them from those who are not. I know the worlds of Halla are in shambles, but it was necessary. This is only the beginning. We are going to make it right this time, Pendragon. We are going to create utopia. I stood up. My head hurt and my legs weren't working that well, but I didn't want to be sitting on the floor to have this discussion. I wanted to be on Neva's level. "What about the Dado attack on Ibera?" I asked. "Did the people of Ibera bring that on themselves?" Neva blinked. She didn't answer right away. I had struck a chord. "They created the situation that allowed for it to happen," she finally answered. "No, they didn't," I shot right back. "They saw that their society was in trouble, looked ahead, and did exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. They created Ibera as a way to save Velox, and they were going to succeed, until St. Dane convinced the flighters to attack and destroy the Pilgrim ships, and then invaded the island with Dados. Where was his grand vision there, huh? The Dado attack was sent as a conquering army, plain and simple. It wasn't the people of Velox who let that happen, it was all St. Dane. How do you explain that?" For the first time since I'd known her, Neva looked unsure of herself. It was about you, Pendragon. It was intended to put you to the test, and you failed. So what if I did? I'm not even from Halla. What was I being tested for? The ends justified the means, she complained. "No!" I shouted back at her. "You can't tell me this is all about doing what is best for Halla. Maybe at one time that's what St. Dane thought. Maybe on some philosophical level he was right. Who knows? But it's not about that anymore. It's about his own selfish goals. He wants to be king, Neva. No, he wants to be God. He wants to create his own Halla. It's the ultimate power play. He's living in a palace. He likes being human. Look how he's changed himself. He's developed vanity. He wants to look good. Don't you see that? That's why he sent conquering armies, and that's why he's built another army of Dados to do it again. Whatever noble thoughts he may have had at one time have been corrupted. If you think he's got any other goal than to be a god, you're kidding yourself." Neva looked stunned. I couldn't believe that my words had hit her that strongly. No way. She was too firmly committed to her mission to let a little argument like this change her mind. But something I had said got through and shook her. "What do you mean he's built another army?" she asked tentatively. "Oh, please," I shot back. "Don't pretend you don't know." "Don't know what?" "We saw the factory, Neva. Where do you think we got shot by the Dados?" "You were found in the helicopter plant." "Yeah, the helicopter plant that also happens to be building about 80,000 Dados. What do you think they're for? Washing windows and doing all the little chores you Ravinians think are beneath you? I'm not an idiot." Neva was shaken. Really shaken. I didn't think she was a good enough actor to fake that. And why would she want to? As far as she was concerned, the battle was over. "Are you serious?" I asked without sarcasm. "You didn't know about the new army of Dados out there, all polished up and ready to go?" Neva's eyes told the story. She really didn't know. It was a total surprise to her. She was about to get another one. "Neva?" came a thin voice. Neva didn't look at first. She kept looking at me, but I saw the change in her eyes. She had heard a voice from the past. One I'm sure she never expected to hear again, and certainly not in a dim room on Third Earth. She held my gaze, silently asking if what she had heard was real. I motioned for her to look. Neva had trouble turning away from me. It was as if she were fighting the pull of a magnet that wouldn't let her turn. But she had to. Slowly, Neva turned to face her mother. Ellie was on her feet. She stood across from Neva, tall and straight, mother and daughter, It was like looking at the same person, though one was several years older. They locked eyes. Neva opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ellie looked strong, stronger than I'd ever seen her. As tough as it must have been to be reunited with her daughter this way, Ellie was up to it. I was proud of her. My fears about her not being able to handle the situation were gone. Ellie didn't say another word. I think she wanted Neva to speak first. Neva was finally able to croak out, "Why are you here, Mother?" Ellie's answer was to haul off and slap her daughter across the face. It was totally unexpected and totally awesome. I wanted to bottle the moment to remember it forever. Unfortunately, something happened that made the sweetness short-lived. We heard a voice come from the doorway. A tall man with long dark hair stood in the frame.
"My,"
Saint Dane said with mock dismay.
"Not exactly a touching reunion."
Journal number 37, Chapter 23. The demon strolled into the room as if he owned it, which he did, I guess. He wore the same deep red princely costume I had seen him in earlier. It still threw me to see his new look, complete with long black hair and the elegant suit. His eyes hadn't changed, though. They still cut right through me.
"I feel sorry for you, Pendragon,"
he said with an air of superiority that made my blood boil. I guess I should have been used to it.
"You've made such a valiant effort for so long, it pains me to see you unable to let go."
Let go of what? I snarled.
"Your coming back here smacks of denial. It's a pathetic attempt to prolong a battle that has long been over. And who do you bring along to help you on this desperate mission? A feeble woman. Is this what the mighty travelers have come to?"
Ellie ignored him. Her eyes were still fixed on Neva. Neva held her hand to her stinging cheek and looked to the floor. It was the first time I had seen Neva Winter cowed. Instead of lashing back, she had taken the slap as if she knew she deserved it. Her reaction to seeing her mother was what I hoped it would be. So far. When Saint Dane reached Ellie, he leaned down to her and whispered,
"Did that make you feel better? Did it take away the pain of knowing the daughter you abandoned grew up to be one of the bad guys?"
It was a vicious thing to say. I wanted to hit him myself. I expected Ellie to whirl and land one on him. Instead, she did something I never would have expected. She stepped forward and took Neva into her arms. She closed her eyes and hugged her daughter. "I miss you," she whispered. Neva didn't hug back, but she didn't pull away either. There were tears in her eyes, though I couldn't tell if they were tears of emotion or from getting whacked in the face.
"That's more like it,"
Saint Dane exclaimed with sarcastic joy.
"Together again. The woman who turned her back on her own destiny and the girl who never should have been."
He smiled, as if realizing something for the first time.
"Never been. Is that the origin of the name Neva? How appropriate."
Ellie held on to Neva, but answered Saint Dane. "I do not regret having given birth to my daughter."
"No?"
Saint Dane taunted.
"The union between a creature of Halla and a spirit from Solara is just unnatural. Then again, it is typical of your way of thinking. No thought to what is right, or to the future consequences of your actions."
He looked right at me and declared,
"And yet you still wonder why you've lost the battle."
Saint Dane walked toward Mark, who hadn't yet budged. I'd almost forgotten about him.
"Go away, Pendragon. Go back to your dying world and stop fighting a battle you lost so long ago."
Neva gently pulled away from Ellie. She stood up straight, regaining her composure. "Is it true?" she called to St. Dane. St. Dane glanced at her.
"Are you speaking to me?"
he asked with surprise. "The Dado army," Neva continued. "Pendragon says that you have created another large force." St. Dane stared at Neva as if he couldn't believe she was questioning him. He stepped away from Mark to face her.
"I have not created a large force. We have. Ravinia has. You are part of Ravinia, or have you forgotten?"
"Of course I haven't forgotten. I just don't understand why I wasn't informed."
"I'm sorry, Neva. I wasn't aware that I needed to consult you on every decision I make. Forgive me."
His comment dripped with sarcasm. "To what end?" Neva persisted. This was getting interesting. Neva was questioning St. Dane. I'd never heard anyone do that before, other than me, of course. St. Dane stiffened.
"I don't believe I appreciate your tone, sweet Neva."
Neva left her mother and walked toward St. Dane. She stood directly in front of him, still waiting for a direct answer. I was mesmerized.
"Must we discuss this here?"
he asked in a low voice. He stole a quick look to me as if to check whether I was watching. I didn't budge, but my pulse was racing. Neva was actually challenging St. Dane. I wondered if it was because of the way he had insulted Ellie, or because he had more or less called her an unnatural mutant. Didn't matter to me either way. I was loving it. St. Dane was off balance. That didn't happen often. Neva had drawn blood. I figured I should rub some salt into the wound. "It's a good question," I said. "If this war is over, why are you building another army?" St. Dane walked to me and looked me in the eye. He was still taller than I was, but not by much. I wasn't threatened by his physical presence anymore. I didn't flinch.
"Because I can,"
was his simple, blunt answer. I chuckled.
"You find that amusing?"
he asked. I turned my back to him and faced Neva. "See? Whatever lofty ideals this guy had, they are long gone. Now it's all about power. His power." I imitated him, saying,
"Because I can."
"Oh, what a badass!" I looked back to St. Dane and scoffed. "Look at him. New hair, new face, living in a palace, an outfit that makes him look like some goofy Disney prince. Not that you know what that is, but trust me, it's a joke." I stood next to Ellie and continued. "And he isn't above insulting a harmless lady like your mom. I don't know what kind of new Halla you think he's going to create, Neva, but if you believe he's worried about anything more than elevating himself to some exalted position of power, you're dreaming." Neva looked unsure. For her, that was huge. Ellie must have seen it too. "There's still time, Neva," she said. "You can still do the right thing." "No!" Neva snapped at her mother. "You don't have the right to say that. You gave that up a long time ago." "Not because I wanted to," Ellie replied. The words pained her. "I wasn't capable of raising you." "But you're capable of jumping around Halla with the travelers." Ellie dropped her head, as if embarrassed. "It's what I was born to do." "Really?" Neva pressed, upset. "What about me? What was I born to do?" Ellie didn't have an answer. She looked defeated. "I guess that's pretty much what we've been fighting over," I said. "Is our destiny chosen for us, or do we have a choice in the matter? What do you think, Neva? If you had to do it all over again, what choices would you make?" Neva was shaken up. Things weren't happening the way she expected. She whirled on St. Dane. "What is the army for?" she demanded. St. Dane was back in control. His emotions were in check.
"You know as well as I do, as do Pendragon and his kind. Let's drop the charade. The remaining exiles of Ravinia must be dealt with the way that was originally intended.
No, Neva shouted. We were to leave the territory untouched, unspoiled. This is not the way.
No territory is unspoiled, Neva,
Saint Dane explained patiently.
I was willing to allow you your little experiment, but circumstances have changed. They should have died, Neva. You know that as well as I. One day we will learn how that mistake occurred, but as of this moment all that matters is that we have located them, and now we must cleanse Halla of their influence.
Neva was trembling. She looked to be on the verge of tears. Saint Dane gave her a twisted smile.
Don't you agree?
Neva started to answer, but stopped herself. She dropped her eyes to the floor. In a small voice, she said, Of course. That was it. Everything we feared was true. Saint Dane had found the exiles and was planning to wipe them out. There was only one piece of the puzzle still missing. Where are they? I asked casually. Saint Dane gave me a sly smile.
Oh? You don't know?
Oops. I was kind of hoping that since we were going to drop the charade, everything was out in the open. Guess not. Now Saint Dane knew that we still hadn't found the exiles. I had made a huge tactical blunder. Saint Dane strolled toward Mark.
I do realize that in large part the situation we now face is of my own doing. I should have seen to it personally that the dissenters from Second Earth were properly handled. But mistakes happen, don't they, Pendragon?
You mean you should have personally killed them? Nice. Really glad to hear that you're planning on running your own universe. Should be a real fun place. Saint Dane shrugged. My sarcasm was lost on him.
No matter. My lack of diligence has only prolonged the inevitable.
You are just ghastly, Ellie gasped. Neva kept her eyes on the floor. Saint Dane continued.
And now I must decide what to do about our situation right here. I don't believe there is anything you can do to stop me, Pendragon. Yet there have been so many times in the past where you have surprised me.
He raised a finger and wagged it at me playfully.
You are quite the resourceful young spirit.
I wanted to grab his bony finger and break it off.
Of course you know that you and Ellie can leave here at any time if you're willing to use what little spirit is left of Solara. I feel confident that you won't.
Really? I asked defiantly. Why's that? Saint Dane kicked aside the green blanket that had been covering an unconscious Mark.
My good friend Mark Diamond. Strangely enough, I've spent more time with him than anyone else in Halla, even more than you, Pendragon. I've grown quite fond of Mark. Such a pity that I'll have to execute him.
What? I screamed. I went for Saint Dane, but only got 2 steps closer before I felt strong hands holding me back. 2 Ravinian guards had slipped into the room without my realizing it.
He is part of an annoying group of guerrillas here on Third Earth,
Saint Dane explained.
They have stolen weapons, food, even helicopters. Any one of those offenses is punishable by death.
You can't kill him, I shouted. I stopped worrying about appearing cool and in control. Saint Dane looked at me with wide, innocent eyes.
And why not?
Because his murder, I shot back. And he was your friend. You may have been using him, but that didn't mean you didn't like each other. I know he liked you, or Andy Mitchell. I was out of my mind. I was willing to pretend that Mark's friendship with Andy Mitchell had positive sides to it. That's how desperate I was to save Mark. I looked at Neva. Neva? Tell me you don't have feelings for Mark. He's a good guy. Hell, he even fits the Ravinian profile. He's exceptional, isn't he? Geez, he's the father of the Dados. He doesn't deserve to die. Neva looked at the unconscious Mark on the floor. I saw her soften. She did like Mark. I knew it. Who didn't? It isn't right, she said softly to Saint Dane. Hasn't he suffered enough?" Saint Dane walked to Neva. He towered over her. She couldn't look him in the eye. Suddenly Saint Dane snapped out with his right hand and grabbed Neva roughly by the neck. Ellie gasped, "Stop that!" He didn't. She had pushed his buttons one too many times. Saint Dane held her tight, lifting her chin so that their eyes met. He spoke in a low growl. "You either believe in the vision, or you are no better than the dirt we've worked so hard to wash away. The choice is yours." "Let her go!" Ellie commanded, her voice cracking. I saw the intensity of the look between Saint Dane and Neva. They held it for a good long time. I was actually afraid he'd choke the life out of her. That's how long they stayed in that position. Finally, Neva blinked and nodded in acceptance. Saint Dane let her go. Neva tried hard not to gasp for breath. She was too proud to show that he had hurt her. "I believe in the vision," she gasped. "I always have and always will. But I do have opinions and would appreciate the right to voice them."
"As do I,"
Saint Dane said, back in command.
"And my opinion is that Mark Diamond is a rebel enemy of Ravinia and will be put to death."
Neva shot him a look, but said nothing.
"Do you have a problem with that?"
Saint Dane asked. Neva shook her head.
"Good. Then you will be pleased to know that the honor of carrying out the execution will be yours, Neva."
Ellie gasped. Neva barely reacted, but I saw her eyes go steely.
"Tell me your opinion of that,"
Saint Dane demanded, taunting. Neva answered through clenched teeth. "It is my duty. I only ask that it happen as soon as possible so that he will not suffer." Saint Dane scoffed.
"And before you lose your nerve."
Neva shot him a steely look. She was definitely back on her game. "Say what you will about me, but I have never lost my nerve." They held eye contact a moment more. I could tell that Saint Dane was debating about how to respond.
"As you wish,"
he finally said, dismissing her remark. He looked down at Mark and gave him a nudge with his foot. Mark stirred and grumbled. Saint Dane smirked.
"Good. I was beginning to think he was already dead."
He turned to me and added,
"Now, Pendragon, will you be leaving us?"
I wanted to tear the guy's heart out, and I might have, if he had one. Saint Dane laughed.
"Of course you won't. You will remain here, hoping to find some way to save your friend."
He motioned to the door. 2 more Ravinian guards entered.
"Take the rebel,"
he ordered, gesturing to Mark. The guards lifted a barely conscious Mark to his feet and dragged him out of the room. Saint Dane glanced around as if looking to see if he had forgotten anything.
"And so it will be," he said. "Make yourselves comfortable. We will reconvene at the execution."
"Which one?" I asked. Saint Dane didn't know what I meant at first. He then smiled and wagged his finger at me.
"Very good. I'm going to miss you, Pendragon."
He strode for the door, then stopped and turned to Neva.
"Come,"
he commanded, as if speaking to a dog. Neva straightened. The hard look was back. There was no hint of sympathy. Whatever second thoughts we had given her were gone. Neva Winter was back to her old, cold self. "I regret this," she said, "but I will not allow my personal feelings to prevent the creation of a new Halla. It is for the greater good. You, of all people, must understand that concept, Pendragon. Sacrifices must always be made." "I do understand," I replied. "I just don't believe that St. Dane's Halla will be good for anybody but himself." "So you've told me," Neva replied, sounding tired. She looked to Ellie and offered her a quick, curt, "Goodbye, Mother." She didn't wait for a response and strode for the door where St. Dane waited. "I love you, Neva," Ellie called after her. Neva hesitated for the shortest of moments, but didn't stop or turn back. She strode past St. Dane and out the door. St. Dane snickered and gestured to the remaining dados. The two guards let go of me and followed St. Dane out. The door was slammed behind them. I heard the sound of the lock being thrown. The two of us stood there, dazed. I put my arm around Ellie. She buried her face in my shoulder and cried. "I'm sorry I brought you back," I said, trying to console her. "It was a mistake." "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Exactly what St. Dane expects us to do. We're going to save Mark." Journal number 37, Chapter 24.